I'd like to now move to the reason why we're here this morning. Talk about, in addition to celebrating these great accomplishments, and let's talk about resilience at USAID. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Greg Collins and invite him to come forward. He is the Director of the Center for Resilience at USAID and USAID Resilience Coordinator for BIFAD. He worked with this board back in October at the World Food Prize meeting and helped develop the proceedings to move forward, and we're going to hear from him as we move forward. So, Dr. Greg Collins.
Great. What a wonderful a day to celebrate the accomplishments of young researchers and more mature researchers. That was a wonderful session. I am going to try and speed up my session a little bit to try and get us back on time. But also worth acknowledging that there's a segue here between the wonderful research going on in Latin America and Niger and our broader efforts to build resilience to recurrent crisis. And as I mentioned to Lauli, we do have a significant focus as USAID on building resilience to recurrent crisis, not only in Niger, but in Maradi as well. So thank you for the BIFAD for again hosting this event, which, as Beth and others have mentioned, is a follow-on from a very successful event we had in Iowa, where we had an opportunity to outline latest thinking on resilience, how not only USAID and other donors, but partner governments have embraced this concept as a means of dealing with the complex risk environments in which they find themselves. And so we're very excited. Part of what we talked about there was the emerging body of evidence on resilience and innovative approaches to resilience measurement. So this is a much more focused discussion today on that subject of resilience measurement. As my colleague Tiffany often reminds me, I should put the bottom line up front. And the bottom line up front is we need your support. We need everybody's support to advance this nascent field of resilience measurement. And this is about building on what practitioners have been building on the fly, tapping the expertise of U.S. universities, the insights to support that applied work, but also advance and evolve resilience measurement through their own research. So I'm super excited to be here today. And I do want to say this evidence is not just useful for advancing our understanding of sources of resilience in different contexts, improving our projects. It's actually having a tremendous and profound policy impact in places like Malawi, where we, the UN, other donor partners, embraced the call by the government of Malawi to leverage the moment of the 2016 El Nino drought and develop a national resilience strategy against which they're committing resources and donors are committing resources, very much in the model of an ending drought emergency strategy that the government of Kenya launched following the 2011-12 drought crisis. People are hungry for evidence. They're using the evidence on the fly in real time, and it's incumbent upon us to continue to advance our understanding of resilience. So let me just spend just a few minutes providing a frame for the discussions that will follow, noting that there's going to be a partnership session later in the day. It's really going to, once we get through a little bit of the substance, really be where the rubber meets the road in terms of how we advance this partnership. So I'm super looking forward to that. There are an array of definitions of resilience out there. Every technical agency comes up with its own nuanced version. USAID's version is about a paragraph long. That overspecification is actually tremendously useful for resilience measurement, but I think we need to remind ourselves that the concept of resilience is actually incredibly intuitive. The ability to manage adversity and change without compromising future well-being. And I think what's important there, and true of all definitions of resilience, resilience is not the outcome of interest. The outcome of interest is well-being, poverty, hunger, malnutrition. Resilience is that ability to manage adversity and change, to manage the array of shocks and stresses that households and communities face, to be able to maintain and advance their well-being despite the increasingly complex risk environments in which they find themselves. You take a place like Maradi in Niger, it's not just the millet head miner, which is frankly new to me. It's also an array of shocks and stresses, drought, floods, conflict, health crisis within an individual household, loss of a wage earner. And households don't experience each of these shocks and stresses independently. They experience the full brunt of the complex, compound nature of these shocks and stresses. And so what we're doing with resilience measurement is unpacking and understanding the array of shocks and stresses people face, the sets of capacities or abilities that enable certain households and communities to manage better than other households. And I think the reason that resilience is resonating so much now, not only with USAID and as Beth mentioned, our own restructuring is being elevated as a priority, but with governments, with communities, with partner organizations, is that we find ourselves in this moment of an incredible set of shocks and stresses that are not only threatening lives and livelihoods, but are posing a threat to national and regional economies. The government of Kenya estimates that they lost $12.1 billion between 2008 and 2011 solely as a result of drought, primarily within the livestock industry. In addition, as a U.S. government, this has also resulted in unprecedented humanitarian need and unsustainable recurrent humanitarian spending in the same places every 3 to 5 years. So there's multiple motivations to be investing in resilience, and how we inform how we invest in resilience is certainly reliant significantly on resilience measurement. I should say resilience measurement and analysis. And I think one of the points that will become clear today is that resilience measurement is not about 2 or 3 indicators, although I'm often asked to provide 2 or 3 indicators. It's about an analytic approach that looks at understanding the sources of resilience that help people mitigate and moderate the impact of shocks and stresses on their well-being and also speed their recovery. I've already mentioned that this is in the face of a complex and compound set of shocks and stresses. But the sources of resilience are also complex, and as Beth mentioned, somewhat context dependent. And they cut across sectors. They even transcend sectors. And the work we're doing on resilience measurement is helping us understand, well, it's actually reinforcing some of our preconception about what are important sources of resilience, things like access to markets, natural resources, financial services, agricultural support in the form of drought and disease-tolerant seeds and approaches that Amadou laid out. But it's also challenging some of the conventional wisdom. One good example of that is research that Professor Mubarak will talk about when he's on one of the panels in Bangladesh, looking at transit subsidies that enabled households to essentially diversify their livelihood risk and eliminate the lean season by being able to access migrant labor and income sources during the lean season. Finally, the evidence is also forcing us to think not only across sectors but beyond sectors, including the role that social capital, confidence to adapt, empowerment, self-efficacy, and aspirations play as sources of resilience. There's a very interesting set of research that Tim Frankenberger and colleagues did looking at floods in Bangladesh in 2014, and the central role that women's empowerment plays in explaining why some households were actually able to maintain their well-being in the face of that shock, while other households were not. One of the challenges we face when we're talking about resilience is the locus of resilience. I'm not going to give the whole USAID definition, but the ability of people, households, communities, systems, and countries to mitigate and adapt to change. So looking at those different scales, we've gotten awful good at measuring resilience amongst people, amongst households, amongst communities. We have a long way to go in looking at systems resilience. It's one thing to say that access to markets makes households and communities more resilient. It's a far different thing to say to measure market systems resilience itself and the nested relationship between household resilience, community resilience, market systems resilience. And it's not just market systems, it's ecological systems, social systems, et cetera. So we made some progress in that regard, but there's an awful long way to go. The other thing I just want to remind ourselves as we get into the more technical and theoretical discussions today, we must always be thinking about how we translate resilience measurement, analysis, and evidence into action, or at the very least, actionable policy and programming implications. When we have a finding that access to financial services is an important source of resilience in Maradi and Niger, that's easy. People know how to program to improving access to financial services. But it's quite another thing when I say in Somalia, one of the most important sources of resilience is social capital, or the ability to lean on other households, or aspirations and confidence. So always being cognizant of the need to translate into action or actionable policy guidance. And I think that's a challenge to this partnership that we hope comes out of this meeting today. One other thing that I mentioned to Pamela as we were greeting each other this morning, part of the reason that resilience has stuck, in my opinion, and I was based in Nairobi in 2011 when USAID really launched its resilience efforts along with the government of Kenya and others. And I, as much as anyone, thought, wow, this might last 18 months, 2 years. But we find ourselves with resilience being elevated and pushed forward. And it's not only because the world's increasingly characterized by more complex and compound risks. It's because, in contrast to vulnerability analysis that looks at people's deficits and what's missing, the concept of resilience focuses on people's capacities, their abilities, their agency. And that's not a subtle wordplay. It's profound. And I think you'll find as we go through today just how profound that shift is. And it forces us to think in entirely new ways beyond the technical sectors that many of us find or root our identities in. And so it's really pushing the envelope in terms of understanding what are sources of resilience and what are people already doing that makes them resilient. You know, I did a lot of my own PhD work in Somalia. And people often say, Somalia, gee, that's a case where they really need resilience. The reality is Somalis are amongst the most resilient people in the world. And building on what they're doing, the way that, in that case, the way they've taken the sort of historical practices of staying connected and staying mobile and employed it on a global scale and rooted in social capital is an example of an adaptation already underway that we need to seize as we look to build resilience. So why this event and why now? The partnership that I called out earlier, we're in desperate need. In desperate need, our capacity is constrained to meet the demand for robust resilience measurement and analysis, the demand of communities, partner organizations, host country governments. We need assistance in driving that applied practical measurement that's informing policy and programming on the fly. We also need to continue to evolve the approach to resilience measurement, and we need the insights and deep bench that the U.S. universities clearly have to support that work as evidenced today. So with that, I will pass it back to BIFAD and look forward to the rest of the event. Thank you.